So tonight's speaker is Dave Sybert from Coastal Studies Institute. And we have started doing these lecture series in Duck this winter. We've done one already on John Henry bias, and we have a few more planned, especially for the winter and early spring season. And tonight's lecture and the last lecture were sponsored by the Bias Speaker Series. And so I'd like to hand the mic over to Mr. James Cofield to tell you a little bit about the Bias Speaker Series and also to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Kristen, and welcome everyone. Kristen did that, but it doesn't hurt to welcome you a second time. We expect the Bias Speaker Series to draw this kind of turnout as it did in the first in this series. The next two are tentatively planned for April and June. And you'll be excited when you see who the speakers are. David Sybert is an education specialist with the Coastal Studies Institute. In this role, he has traveled as far away as Antarctica to support the research conducted by the Coastal Studies Institute scientists. His main focus at CSI is to make the work of scientists available and understandable for middle and high school students, and us here. David has been a part of numerous archaeological expeditions, including many NOAA, led Battle of the Atlantic expeditions. As an avid scuba diver, he has trained to go over 300 feet below the surface of the ocean, and is also an instructor to teach the next generation of underwater scientists. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that David is married to our very own Kristen Legner. And without further ado, it's all yours, David.
All right, thank you for that introduction. I don't use a microphone, so hopefully everyone can hear me. If you can't hear me, just let me know and I'll speak much louder. I don't mind at all. So my role at CSI is to make what we do interesting for middle and high school students as well as the general public, but I really take a lot of pride in bringing sometimes what's not very interesting down and making it interesting for 8th graders that maybe aren't super interested in anything. But tonight what we're talking about is one of my favorite subjects, and so I don't have any problem tonight making sure that you guys are going to really enjoy this and be interested in what we're talking about. So before we get started, I did just need to go through what CSI is and who we are, because we're going through some changes right now. And so what we are is a research and education institute that's in Wanchese on Roanoke Island. We're the Outer Banks campus for East Carolina University, but we don't just serve East Carolina University. We also serve these other 4 institutions. So we're inter-university in nature, which means we work with all these different institutions. Tonight, our focus is on maritime archaeology. We have someone at the Coastal Studies Institute that also is a professor at ECU. He teaches in the graduate program there. He's now head of the graduate program there for maritime archaeology. His name is Dr. Nathan Richards. But that's an example of how CSI works, is that we have people that teach on campus at ECU and people that do research on the coast, and CSI serves as the infrastructure and the support system to make that happen. And so what we're interested in at the Coastal Studies Institute is problems facing this area, challenges facing northeastern North Carolina, and bringing scientists together from different subject matters that will work together to try to solve those problems. And so we have these 5 different areas of research. These are what we really focus on. One that I always like to point out that we're really interested in right now is called ocean energy. And so we're looking at ways to create electricity using ocean currents. And our big goal right now is to better understand the Gulf Stream and figure out if there's a way that it makes sense for the state of North Carolina to get some of their electrical needs from the power of moving water off our coast here. And so we have an oceanographer working on that. We have an economist that helps with that. We have a series of graduate students. And we're not the only ones. We're leading the charge on this, but there's many other universities and private industry that's involved in that. But tonight, our main focus is going to be on maritime heritage. We're going to talk a lot about shipwrecks. There are a wide variety of shipwrecks that are found in North Carolina from all different places. A lot of the pictures I'm going to use tonight, I decided to use pictures of myself. But we also, some other pictures we have are some that I've taken. And so part of my role as an educator is to bring the story to people that can't visit. And so for shipwrecks, that makes a lot of sense, right? There's not a lot of people probably that can go 250 feet underwater, but there's stories that still need to be told. And so we use imagery to make that happen. And so tonight what I plan to do is just talk a little bit about archaeology, what it is, to go over a few specific shipwrecks, and then to move right into the technology that we use to find shipwrecks and to identify shipwrecks, because that, a lot of different technology, it's really only used for this one thing, a lot of interesting things happening there. And then we're going to talk about techniques that archaeologists use. I have a couple things for after the program where you can try to identify a shipwreck. We also have an activity where you can try to match up a series of photographs to make a photogrammetric model. And those are things that we do maybe with a little higher technology than we're giving you tonight, but the same type of idea. And so these are kind of challenges to see how well you do at the end if you decide to do that. So what is archaeology? Right, with archaeology, we're studying the past through what people have left behind. And so that's what's happening. We're not looking at fossils or plants or animals or things like that. We're really interested in what people have left behind and what we can learn from it. And so I always tell 8th graders or high school students, you have to imagine a time before the internet. You have to imagine a time before cell phones and social media. And so maybe all we know about this shipwreck and why it sank is what we can find from looking at it now. And so going underwater and studying what's there, are the hatches open, are the hatches closed, it looks like there's a big hole in the side. So you have to do a diagnostic. It's not the same as today where they'd be able to radio what was happening right away and everyone would know what was going on. It's in a time where there's clues available and we're gonna have to look at those clues. And so that's kind of what archaeology is. And I always tell them too, we're in such a unique place to be interested in archaeology, right? What happened here on the Outer Banks that's historically important? Anything, ever? The lost colony, right? So there's still people studying that today. We still don't have all the answers to that. Even though we've identified this is where it took place, we still are not exactly sure what happened. There's still new artifacts that are found. So this study is still ongoing, even though we're looking at things that happened hundreds of years ago. And so there's still a really important thing. Archaeology is still something that's really prevalent today. And when we talk about maritime archaeology, all that really means is we're shifting our focus and we're studying things that have happened in or around the water. And so this area, right, we've always been involved in fishing and boat building. People have traveled here through boats to get here, and so there's a lot of archaeology that takes place in water environments or understanding what's left behind from water environments. And so I use a lot of video, as I was saying before. Part of what we do at CSI, we have a production studio and we make these videos to help people understand what's happening. It's better, well maybe not better. It gives you a different perspective than me telling you and showing you pictures to have some of the scientists talking to you and showing you what they're really working on. And so I have a series of videos that we're going to show. This real short one in the beginning just kind of explains from Dr. Richard's perspective why archaeology is so important and why the cultural heritage of this area is so important. Hopefully you guys can hear it.
Maritime Heritage and archaeological resources. From local thing you spent, hundreds of hours in the library trying to track down and interpret and predict where it might be.
Can everybody hear that all right? Yeah, so I'm going to go back through some of that as we go through the presentation. But that was Dr. Richards I was telling you about before. He's now the head of the Maritime Studies program at ECU. And so there has been a series of activities that have taken place with ECU where students have come out here to study what's happening on the Outer Banks, and we're going to show you some pictures and talk about those in just a little bit. But why it's so important where we are, right? So some people call this the graveyard of the Atlantic. There's between 2,000 and 5,000 shipwrecks along our coastline. And so if you look at this map, I know you can't read it, but that's kind of the point. There's so many shipwrecks bunched in here that you can hardly see what's there. And so we are still finding shipwrecks all the time. Shipwrecks are washing ashore from time to time. They move around. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how you identify them and why that's not an easy thing to do, right? So it's very rare that something washes ashore with a name on the side of it still. Right, so we need to do some investigations and to try to figure out which ship it is, and when there's all these different choices and we didn't have the internet or things like that to look at, it's pretty difficult to figure it out. But there is a lot of historically important things that have happened out here. We're going to talk a little bit about World War II tonight and what occurred right off our coast during World War II. But keep in mind, even when we think we've identified shipwrecks, there have been occasions when we've been able to go back and realize that wasn't what we thought it was, and it gets switched. So there's some ships that are called by multiple names now because we thought it was the Papoose, and it really turned out to be a different ship than that. So there's some confusion that even happens then. But my first two examples are ones that are kind of local to this area. One's called the Momi T. It's on 159 Buffel Head Rd. So what we know about this ship, if it is the ship that we think it is that it was built in 1904 in Mystic, Connecticut. It's a schooner type. It's often covered by sand, right? And so during the field school in 2010, a group of ECU students came out here for over a month. One of the things they did was to dig that out so they could better identify what it was, and then they drew it by hand. And so even though we're going to talk about lots of different types of technology tonight, some of it still happens with paper and pencil and measuring tapes. And so they go out there and they draw by hand what they see, and that's actually what I'm standing on when I'm asking you to identify the shipwreck later tonight. This was all drawn by a series of students by hand underwater. And so there's special paper that they use, but normal number 2 pencils, and they go down there, they drew all this by hand, and then they put it all together when they bring it up. And we're going to see some video of that happening as well. Another difficulty with shipwrecks is they don't always stay the same name. And so throughout their life, they'll be purchased by different people that'll change the name of it. So tracking it back through history can also make it more difficult. Has anyone visited this one at 159 Buffel Head Rd? Oh, good. Yeah. So it's out there. It's probably not the same today as it was in 2010. It's probably changing all the time based on what's happening with water currents, the amount of sand on it, weathering, all those types of things. And so one of the things that archaeologists like to do is to get baseline data. And so to say in 2010 it looked like this, in 2019 they could go back out and see how it's changed over time, and that may tell them more about the story. Another local wreck, it's up in Carlisle, it's called the O'Keefe wreck. This wreck was named after the person that found it. So we're still not 100% sure what this one is either. It was discovered in 1997. Same thing. Sand moves in and out. Sometimes there's a lot of it uncovered, sometimes there's not very much. They think it could be the Metropolis. That's what they're leaning towards. And so the Metropolis was a steamer built in 1861, originally called the Stars and Stripes, that was involved in some Civil War blockades. So historically important, if that is in fact the shipwreck that it was. They think it wrecked in 1878. Same thing, right? There's not a lot of information available from 1878, so it's hard to know. They did do something really interesting with this wreck. So you can see in the picture that's Dr. Richards again. He's taking a picture of the shipwreck, and there's targets on the ground. And so one thing that they can do is they can take hundreds and hundreds of photos of the shipwreck, and then using a program, they can build a three-dimensional model of what's there. And so instead of just having it drawn, we can print out a model of what it looks like, and then they have that, and they can kind of fly around it like Google Maps. You guys have seen that. You can fly around it to see all the details of the shipwreck at that time. And so that's a really great way for them to know what's out there without spending thousands of hours detailing every little nick and cranny in the wood. They can do all that with pictures. And so we're moving towards that with drones, as well as taking things from the side and underneath so that we can get a better idea of what's happening. Now this is a question that comes up all the time, almost every time I do this. And it is not an easy question to answer, but what happens if you find a shipwreck or a piece of a shipwreck? Who does it belong to? Who owns it? And so it depends on where you find it. If it was involved in any kind of military action, it's protected by the Sunken Military Craft Act, and it actually still belongs to the country of origin. So there's 4 German U-boats off our coast here that were all involved in battles during World War II. They still belong to Germany. And so their product, you know, the part of them is still German government owned. So you're not supposed to take things off of it. A lot of the military craft are also war graves, and so it's the same type of reverence that you would want to have for another gravesite. You won't want to go in and remove things from it, but that's protected by law. There's also the Abandoned Shipcraft Act. Anything within state waters, which is within 3 nautical miles, is protected as well. So it's difficult, and I always like to question Dr. Richards about it. Well, what if I find a piece of a shipwreck that we think maybe was from this wreck, but it's hard to identify, and like maybe you just find a gun or a bottle or something like that. You know, how do you know where it came from? Can you say for sure it's protected on the Military Craft Act? And so it gets very gray area. You know, if you're walking along the beach and something washes up in front of you, identifying where it came from can be very difficult. But it's still probably not your property. And so that's what it comes down to, is if you find it on the beach, that's state property, that's not your property. We've even been questioned if my dog digs up something in the backyard and it turns out to be from a shipwreck, who owns that? If it's on your property, technically it's yours, but if it's anywhere else, basically it's not yours to take. Just like if you find a wallet in the parking lot tonight, it's not technically your wallet. So that's the best kind of course of action to think about, is that if you find something, really the best thing to do is to call the NC Office of State Archaeology, and the phone number's there, and I believe Christian has information she's going to share too if anyone has questions about that. But you could call them and say, a weird piece of wood just washed ashore, I'm not sure what it is, and they might send somebody out to take a look at it. You can also email Dr. Richards. I'm not sure how quick his response time is at the moment, but he's really interested in all these things. And when he was stationed out here, he would respond to them and go identify what they were. But they all ask that you do not destroy, remove, or deface any part of the ship. And what's really interesting is all parts of this ship tell a story. And what I'm standing on tonight kind of identifies that. So all these pieces, all these details are used to try to identify what kind of shipwreck it is. So if you were to go down there and remove a piece of it, you've taken part of the story, and they may not be able to identify it any longer based on that. And so every part of the shipwreck is important, and where it is even tells them something. So moving things around and taking things, they really ask that you don't do that, and in a lot of cases it's against the law. So moving from land to ocean, we want to talk about what happened during World War II. And so during World War II off the coast here, it's called Battle of the Atlantic, there was many, many interactions between German submarines and Allied vessels. And so the U-boats are running up and down the coast here. There is lots of historical record and oral histories from the Hatteras area of people seeing fires off the coast at night, and then sailors washing ashore in the morning. And so there's still people that tell us those stories. We know they happened. I don't want to say it's a rumor, but I've never seen the documentation that they found sailors with movie tickets in their pockets, German sailors that had obviously come to shore and been ashore for a while in the Outer Banks, and then they went back out to restock their vessels. And like I said, I haven't seen actual documentation, but that's kind of the story that's going around about it. So this area during World War II, highly impacted by what was happening off the coast. There's many, many shipwrecks. They're asking people to keep their lights out because the ships could be silhouetted against the lights of the shoreline and make an easier prey for the German submarines. So huge battles that were taking place. 91 vessels were lost off the coast of North Carolina during World War II. So I grew up in Maryland. This is something I never heard anything about until I came here. And so this is a part of our history that's not really well told, which is part of the reason for these Battle of the Atlantic expeditions and for these videos and everything, is to kind of tell this story. This happened right off our coast here. It's one of the closest places that World War II came to shore on the mainland. And so 79 of those vessels were merchant vessels, 8 were Allied naval ships, and 4 were German U-boats. And so part of the stories don't always have to do with the Navy. During that time, they were calling up basically people that had boats, merchant marines. Some of the boats they outfitted were fishing vessels that they put guns on, and they would send them out there to fight the German U-boats. And so there's a lot of stories like that where they weren't necessarily naval-trained officers out there fighting the Germans. Sometimes it was people that were in not as great situations. There's a story that we looked at with the ROV because it was 380 feet underwater, a boat called the YP-389, which stood for Yard Patrol Boat. It was a fishing trawler. It still had the fishing nets on board. They sent it out there with a gun to fight the Germans, and there was no firing pin in the gun. So they didn't stand a chance. So there's stories like that that happened right here, right off our coast here, that aren't necessarily just Navy, that's also other people involved. So there's those 4 German submarines we talked about. We've now found all 4 that we know about in the North Carolina waters. That just happened in 2014. We were able to identify where the last one was. But why there was so much happening off North Carolina, it has a lot to do with the currents. And so we have that warm water current coming up the coast. We have a cold water current coming down, and where those two things meet, right, there's going to be sediment that falls out, so we get shoaling that takes place. And so the submarines could kind of hide behind the shoals and then get into deep water quickly if they had to. And so we kind of presented a great place for them to be hunting. And there was also a lot of trade that was taking place along our coast here. So there was a lot of boats moving back and forth. And that was the goal of the submarines, was to mess up the trade routes. They were trying to keep things from going across the ocean to support the war effort. They were trying to mess up what was happening between North and South and the war effort there. So their goal was to disrupt those trade routes, and they did a pretty good job. That when the war first started, we had no way to retaliate against the U-boats. And so over time, we developed better ways to do it. But in the first part of the war, the U-boats were definitely winning over here. So events in North Carolina, where they came from, 55% were American vessels. And you can see all those dots. All those dots were interactions during the war. And so lots and lots of things are taking place right off our coast. So we're going to talk a little bit in the technology section about a specific World War II vessel and how we found it and the technology we used. And that's just kind of the basics of the Battle of the Atlantic and what took place out there. From there, I want to talk about shipwrecks that weren't necessarily sunk by accident or during a battle. And so there's artificial shipwrecks off our coast that are sunk on purpose, and that is because of what shipwrecks are for the ecosystem, the value that they serve. And so artificial reefs draw in all this life. And so this picture, it is actually not an artificial reef, but I really like the picture. But this is a shipwreck that's off the coast of Cape Hatteras. It's got that big wheel, the big ship's wheel, and then it's got all those beautiful colors on it too. So there's all these corals and sponges and things that attach to the shipwreck that draw in small marine life, and then larger marine life come to eat the smaller marine life, and you get an entire ecosystem that's revolving around what's happening right out there on the shipwreck. When you look at this picture on the left, those are sand tigers. And so this was out of Morehead City. We were diving out of Morehead City. There was hundreds of sand tigers that were all mating in the sand right off the shipwreck. And so they're still trying to understand. There's a new project going on that's a citizen science-based project where they're asking people to take pictures of sand tigers when they see them, and then they're trying to track where those sand tigers are moving. We still don't fully understand how sand tigers use the North Carolina waters and off the coast of North Carolina, you know, for mating and for their population. And so that was just a really interesting, no one expected that to be there. So we get down to the sand, we look over, and then sharks as far as you can see. But so that's all because of the shipwrecks. They're drawn to those areas of shipwrecks. So if you were to look at the bottom of the ocean, there's certainly caverns and depth changes, but a lot of it's pretty flat. And sometimes we describe it as like a desert. And the shipwrecks would be the oasis. So there's a change in elevation, it draws things to it, things grow on it, and we have a whole new ecosystem revolving around those ships that are underwater. And so this is just another picture. This is also a little bit south of here in the right off of Hatteras, right, we get that warm water that turns with the Gulf Stream. And so the difference between diving off of Nag's Head and diving off of Cape Hatteras can be significant as in water clarity as well as water temperature. And so it's usually a little bit warmer down there and usually a little bit clearer. And when you come up here and we get the cold water coming down the coast from the Chesapeake Bay, as well as the Labrador Current, the water is usually colder and a little bit murkier. And so depending on where you're diving, you can get vastly different situations of what's going on. But this is a picture of me. I'm diving a rebreather in this situation. And so I did want to talk a little bit about the technology with scuba diving. So this piece of technology allows us to stay underwater deeper and longer because it's pumping in the exact amount of oxygen we need to breathe so that we're not having as much impact from the nitrogen that's in the air that we're breathing. So everyone knows, we all remember this, I'm sure, from 8th grade, that in the air we breathe right now, what's in the air that we breathe? Okay, how much nitrogen? 78%. Very good. Yeah. And how much oxygen? 21%, very good, 21%. 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, 1% inert gas. So that's what's in the atmosphere right now. In a recreational scuba diving situation, they pump that with a compressor and they put it in a tank, and that's what you breathe. In technical diving, when we're going deeper than 130 feet and we're staying for longer, and we know that we're taking in enough gas that we just can't come to the surface, we change up those gas levels so that we are benefiting and not having as much issue. So the issue with scuba diving is the nitrogen. We take that nitrogen, we breathe it under pressure, and it gets into different tissues within our body. And so, without going too deep into this, when we dive on a rebreather, we add in more oxygen, and we can also add in helium. And so now we're reducing the amount of nitrogen we're breathing, so we stay longer, it doesn't go into our tissues as much, and so we don't have to decompress on the way up as long. And so when we go too deep for too long, there's all these bubbles of nitrogen in our body, and we have to come up really slowly to give them time to come out. If you come up too fast, it's something called the bends, where that nitrogen can get locked in your joints, and it can cause a lot of problems. So when we dive like this, we call it decompression diving, because we know that we can't just come straight to the surface. We're gonna have to stop at 70 feet, 60 feet, 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet. And we may be underwater for over an hour just waiting to come up. And so that's a different kind of training that you take to be prepared that whatever happens underwater, you're dealing with underwater. Coming up to the surface isn't an option. And so you have redundancy on everything that you take. Your buddy has redundancy, so if I needed more air, I could go to my buddy. We have different mixes, and so it gets a lot more technical, but we do all that so we can visit these places that you can't normally go to, like shipwrecks that are 200 feet underwater. So this video was all shot in North Carolina. We don't need the noise anymore. And so it's just going to show you the life that's out there. And so the important role that these reefs play in attracting life. And so a lot of times people think this is Florida or the Keys or the Caribbean. But it is right off the coast of North Carolina. A lot of people don't realize that all this is out there. And so some of these shipwrecks, right, are disarticulated, are broken up. They wire drug a lot of them during the war so that the U-boats couldn't hide behind them. So they would drag wires over top of them and break them all to pieces. But some of them are still intact, and they may sit 40, 50, 60 feet off the bottom of the ocean. So they're really tall, really large, and there's a lot of room. This is a picture of a German submarine. So you can see there's not a lot there, right? It's a pretty small vessel. It's not very tall, has pretty big guns. That's another picture of the front of a German submarine. And that's that sand tiger shark we were talking about that's attracted to those areas. We think they use them for mating. So some of these, especially the ones from World War II, are, there's still human remains on them. I personally never have seen human remains on the ship, especially if it's been in the water since 1940, 1942. There's a lot of wave action and sand that have impacted these, and so they're not like they were when they first went down. And so, but some of the German submarines, we think the hatches were closed when they sank, and so all the sailors would still be inside. And some of the big tankers and things, they know that they didn't get everyone off in time. So yeah, there's still human remains.
When you find one from a different nation, do you have to report it to the nation of origin?
Yeah, so the projects we've been involved with that have been searching for different vessels, they usually notify the vessel, like when we were looking for the U-boat, the German government knew that we were searching for the U-boat. I say we, it was a NOAA-led project. So there's NOAA, the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary, they led the project, and there was a series of partners involved in the project, and our role in the project was really the documentation of what was happening and the videos and the footage, whereas the archaeologists from NOAA and CSI and some other groups were involved in taking the research and understanding what was happening with it. Sure. Sorry. And so here you can see some archaeologists working. Like we were saying, we're going to talk about the technology in a second, but they're using underwater paper, #2 pencil, and they're measuring and drawing and all that happening underwater. So I always challenge middle and high school students, how many people think they're good at art? And people raise their hand. I was like, how many people think they could do that 30 feet underwater, keeping track of how much air you have with a swell moving you back and forth, keeping track of your buddy, and still being able to draw accurately? It's not something I can do. That's why I take pictures. It's much easier. But there are people that are really pretty proficient at it, and it's what they do. You know, that's their profession. So we're going to switch gears again. We're going to talk about technology. And for technology, we're going to focus on finding the U-576. So the U-576 was the last German submarine. We didn't know where it was, and I say we, but I'm talking about no one knew where the U-576 was. So they were looking for it, and looking for it as a series of projects. And like Dr. Richards said, the first step in trying to find a shipwreck is going to the library and spending hundreds of hours looking at where the ship may have went down, what happened with the battle records, what kind of captain's translations or interactions they could look at and try to figure out what was going on. So they made a grid. This was a graduate student's project, and they found where they thought the highest probability was that these ships would be. And so there was a battle that took place between the U-576 and a vessel called the Bluefields and a series of other vessels. And the Bluefields got sunk, and it was much larger than the U-576. And so they decided they were going to look for the Bluefields in hopes that they would find the U-576 close by, since it was also sunk in that same battle. And so that's what they did. They looked for the much larger ship, which had a bigger signature. And so in this picture, you can see the two of them very close together, but a much larger signature from the Bluefields, and then a smaller one for the submarine. The submarine's round tubes, not very large, and so much harder to find using some of this different technology. So once we have kind of a field where we think it might be, the next step is using something called side scan sonar. And so side scan sonar is very similar to how a fish finder works, right? So it sends out an acoustic signal. Based on how that acoustic signal comes back, they can kind of get an image for what's happening underwater. And so the fun part of this is they call this mowing the lawn. And so they drag this behind the boat pretty slow, between 5 and 8 knots, and they will make sure they don't skip any area of the ocean in the area we're looking. So you just go back and forth, and everyone else on the vessel doesn't have much to do until we get some targets. And so they would do this until they had identified that whole area that they were interested in, and then they would go back and look at the targets, the areas they're not sure what they were. And this is an example of what it might look like. If this is a really good signature, and you can see the difference in color. Those black areas are shadows, so that means there's a change in topography, so there's a change in elevation. Something's there. And this is still unidentified to this day. It's in 240 feet of water off of Diamond Shoals. But they would get a series of targets like this, and sometimes they'd be able to say, that looks like a rocky outcropping. That might be a bunch of shopping carts, whatever it might be. But oftentimes they're not sure what it is, and that's when we would go back and kind of use the next piece of technology, which would take us a little bit closer. So this is a picture of that signature for the Bluefields that we were searching for. This is what it came up as. And so they could tell, based on that, some basic measurements, how long they think it might be, and then also pretty sure that that might be a ship. Once we have an idea that it's probably a ship and we want to investigate further, the next step would be using this thing called an AUV, which is an autonomous underwater vehicle. And so what this does is they program it to run a specific search pattern, and it can also take a series of other measurements and things like that. And then it goes off of the ship. It's not attached to the ship in any way. It runs its pattern, and then you have to go pick it back up. And when I was lucky enough to go to Antarctica on a different project, we had to pick up someone's AUV that broke a wing and ended up way off track. So they had to go into an island area and search for it, because they have a little pinger that kind of tells you where it is. But as you can imagine, these are not cheap things. And so it was actually from Rutgers University. They really wanted it back. And so they were able to talk the group I was in to go and get it. But this video, really short, just a minute or two long, is going to show you guys, this is the part of the project where we thought that we had identified what we thought was U-576, but no one knew for sure. It's in over 800 feet of water, and so it was not something we could just send divers down. And so using the AUV, the hope was that they would get a confirmation that this was the ship that they were looking for as part of these Battle of the Atlantic projects. And so that ship that we are working off of, that was a NOAA vessel that was owned by the Monitor Sanctuary. They don't have it any longer. It was called the Sand Tiger. It was 85 feet long. It used to be a patrol boat for Homeland Security, so it could go very, very quickly, which is not something we really needed. But it was outfitted to be a dive vessel, basically, and to run this different technology. And these two gentlemen at the computers, that was their job, was to go with that AUV on any project in the world that it needed to be used for. They were specialists. It's not something that somebody else could just do. You know, they were trained to do that all the time. So they send the AUV out, it runs its pattern, and then they have to go find it and pick it up. And they were very lucky. I wasn't actually on this portion of the project, but you can see the sea state is wonderful. That AUV is over hundreds of thousands of dollars, and so you wouldn't want to pick that up out of a rolling ocean and try to get it back on board the boat. It just wouldn't go well. And this type of technology doesn't give you real-time data like some of the other technology does. Like the side scan sonar, as soon as we pass over a target, you see it on the computer screen, but this one you have to plug in and get the data off of it when it comes back. And that's the photo that they found, right? So that's what was on there. What do you guys think? Definitely, right? So that is definitely a German submarine. So that's what they were looking for. And when that happened in 2014, I believe it was 2014, that made national news. That was all over the national news that the German submarine had been found. It hadn't been seen since 1942. It was a really big deal. I have some facts about it. It was a Type 7C U-boat. Carried out 5 patrols in North Carolina waters, sinking 4 ships, over 15,000 gross tons, damaging 2 more, sunk in July 1942 from depth charges from 2 U.S. aircraft, gunfire from a merchant ship, and it was near the east coast of the United States. That's the details that they had. So,
what's the size of that?
my best guess would be 150 feet long. And the Bluefields was in the 300 to 400 foot range that they're identifying to try to find the submarine after they found it, so it was much smaller than that. Another piece of technology that we could use is called an ROV. One of the local high school teams built an ROV the First Flight High School. They built an ROV that actually won the international competition. But these are slightly different ROVs. These are working class ROVs that can go thousands of feet deep. But we could use that once we knew where the shipwreck was. We could go over top of it with a boat, drop it down. It's cabled to the boat, unlike the AUV, so they get the information right away, and they can steer it. It's kind of like a video game. They look through a little panel. It's got cameras on the ROV. It's got lights, and they can steer it and make it go and identify what they need to do. So ROV is an option if it's too deep for divers and we need more details on the ship. Another option, which I was never lucky enough to do, is to go down in a 2-man submarine. So one year of the project, they actually took these submarines out. They went down 750, 800 feet underwater, and they were able to visit the U-576. So they were the first people to see it since it sank over 70 years ago. And so that's the U-576. That's what it looks like underwater. Its location is known. It's not a secret or anything like that. Now that it's been identified, it's out there that people can fish over it and do all those types of things. It's right there. That's what it would look like from inside the sub. I understand it was very hot inside the submarine. It's because it was August. So before, when they were getting it off and into the water, the sun was really beating on them, and then they go down 700 feet and it'd be pretty cold, and then they come back and it'd be hot again. I was on the deck of the boat that was supporting the submarines while they were underwater when they found it, which was really neat. But they have they're battery powered, so they're really worried about running out of battery and having the submarine be lost. My coworker got to go down in one of the submarines, and I would say he was excited but nervous, right there. You're gonna be 700 feet. There's 2 of them, and so they could support each other, but I imagine towing a submarine back or something like that from 700 feet underwater would be pretty tough. One other really interesting piece of technology from this project was a laser scanning sonar. It was the first time it was ever used in this capacity. And so they attached it to the little 2-man subs, and then they put pingers out. It's almost like how GPS works, that they would be able to triangulate where they were exactly in space, and then use lasers to be able to draw what they were seeing. And so they were able to remake the ship using this laser technology, and so they have all the details of what's there, which is even creating it in 3D space, basically, so they know exactly what's happening. And so this short video is going to show you guys the submarines going down underwater. That thing I was just talking about is right there on the front. So like I was saying, it had never been used underwater like this before, so they had to figure out how to rig it, how many of those points they had to put underwater for it to work. And when I think one of the best jobs on this boat, because this was a different group that actually ran the vessels and took care of the submarines, is that guy with the helmet on. So he would get to go out there on top of the submarine, and then he'd unclip it and have to get back to the boat. And that just looked like a lot of fun. So what's great about the U576, this is the fourth one. There's the U85, which is about 16 miles out of Oregon Inlet. There's the U701, which is off the coast of Cape Hatteras and about 130 feet of water. And there's the U352, which is out of the Morehead City area. So those are the 4 submarines in North Carolina, or off of North Carolina. But what's great about the U576 is it's so deep that it hasn't really been disturbed. And so this is a great example of what it would look like and what was there when it sank. Where some of the other shipwrecks, the U85 for instance, have been visited by divers for a very long time. And so there's pieces that have been removed. It's in shallow water, so it's more impacted by hurricanes and waves. And so it's a little more, there's not as much there. Whereas the U576 is pretty pristine as far as those things go. And then they also found the blue fields that I was telling you about earlier on the same expedition. So they were able to go down and visit that as well. I understand that's called a snowy grouper. There was also a gentleman from NOAA Fisheries on this trip, and his goal was to be able to use some of those same technologies, but identify species of fish based on the signature that came back. And so he was looking at those clouds of fish that are usually found over top of shipwrecks, and if you could look at that cloud and understand what type of fish it was based on the signature of the acoustic signal, which is really interesting. All right, we're getting close. We're getting close. So, basic technology you guys could all use. Scuba diving. We talked a little bit about it earlier. I kind of alluded to it, but it's a way that we can visit things underwater. You can become a recreational scuba diver in just about a week's time, and some training and some classes. Allows you to breathe compressed gas underwater, and there's a series of science that goes into understanding how your body reacts, what pressures and depths are involved, how volumes react in different situations and things like that. So that's really where we can get into teaching the middle and high school students about those different things, but put it towards a scuba perspective. And this is something we asked them to do, and I didn't know if you guys would be into it or not, but when we're diving underwater, we have all this equipment on, and we need to communicate with our buddy what's happening. And so when I was telling you about the rebreather doesn't make any bubbles. It actually recycles the air that I breathe, and it puts new oxygen in, and it uses something we call it sorb, that takes the CO2 out. It scrubs it out, it holds it, and then we put new oxygen in, and we breathe that same gas over and over again. So it doesn't make any bubbles, which lets us, it benefits us because the tanks we carry are really small, because we don't need a lot of extra gases. But with a rebreather, I don't make bubbles, so I can actually talk through my regulator. It's harder because your lips are closed, but I could explain, I don't want to go over there. You could try to tell your buddy that. But when we're breathing in open circuit, which means I'm off-gassing, so I breathe in and I exhale, you can't do that really. So you have to be able to use your hand signals. And so I always ask, can you guys sign that? Can you figure out how to sign that? I am cold, I don't want to swim to the boat. Someone if I have action, right, swim would be like this. It'd be, I am cold, I want to swim up to the boat. And you have to be good at it. My wife and I dive together. And it's important to communicate. It's important to communicate even underwater. If she's cold and she wants to leave and I'm not picking up on that, that could be a problem later. Another one I ask them to do is look behind you, there's a large shark. So we do dive with sharks all the time. And my dive buddy is usually a guy named John McCord that works at the Coastal Studies Institute. He's the one that makes all these films. And so he usually uses a really big camera with really large lights, and so his focus isn't always on what's happening around him. And so sometimes I have to let him know that there's something coming that he might want to be aware of, because he's looking at the screen, right? And so there's other things basically that you need to communicate to people. And so that brings us to photo and video. That's a big part of why we're doing the diving that we're doing, is to document these things. We can shoot in higher resolution that TVs can show. We've been involved in 3D projects. All the video you saw tonight, most of it was shot by John or myself, mostly from John. And so we do these different things basically to be able to bring these stories back. I have up in the front here, if you guys want afterwards, to try one of these photomosaics. And so a photomosaic, if you wanted to take a picture of this building and it was light outside, everyone in here could do it, right? You could just move far enough back until you got the whole building in frame. If we wanted to take a picture of a shipwreck, we can't just move far enough back till the whole shipwreck is in frame, right? There's a lot of things in the water column, there's not as much light down there. And so what we do is we take detailed pictures up close, and we move over and we take another detailed picture, we move over, we take another detailed picture, and then when you come up, you have to stitch all those together. And so we have an activity later where you guys can try to stitch together a series of pictures to make the U85, which is right off our coast here, and make it look just like it does underwater. So that's called photomosaics, and that gives us an overall view of what's happening. And those are some examples of photomosaics that have been done. That bottom one is a shipwreck I really want to visit called the E.M. Clark that's over 300 feet deep, but it's still fully intact, and it's from World War II. So it's a gigantic tanker that's still underwater. It looks just like that. That was a series of many dives that they had to take pictures on to be able to recreate that. And then even a step further, instead of just taking it from one angle, if we take pictures from all angles of the ship, we can restitch that together and make a three-dimensional wreck of it. And so that's called photogrammetry, and that's what I was talking about with the Momi T out here and some of the other beach wrecks that they did, except it's slightly more difficult when you're not using drones and you're having people swim at a specific depth and take pictures the same depth all the time. And then this is kind of the why, and so all these things are happening basically so we understand what's out there. And like I said before, it's interesting to think about all the technologies that we have and the way that we use them, but when you get people in the water, they're using #2 pencils and paper, and they're still drawing what's there, and that's what's underneath me, and I hope you guys take a quick look at it. This was all hand-drawn, and it provides a level of detail that sometimes we can't get using all those different technologies. And so this last video, this is the last one, is going to show you guys the field school from ECU that I was telling you about that spent a month out here studying these shipwrecks, learning how to be an archaeologist basically, and they would visit different ships and learn these techniques and then bring all their work together. So these are graduate students, so they could be any age really, but most of them have mid-20s. There were some older ones too that want to do this for a living, and so they go back to graduate school. And there's a lot of government type jobs. You know, there's BOEM that looks at wind energy sites. They have to look at culturally important resources. There's NOAA, there's Park Service. All those different groups have underwater branches where archaeologists can work. And like I was showing you a lot of pictures and video tonight, this video doesn't look particularly great, does it? This is what it looks like a lot of times right off our coast here in like 20 feet of water. And so this is a dive on the Huron, which someone was talking about earlier that had been on the site. Yeah, so this is the students that are out there on the Huron looking at this site. And what they do is they run a baseline, so they run a wire right down the middle of the site that has a tape measure connected to it, and then they're going to measure off of that tape measure to be able to figure out where they are on the wreck, and they'll draw to scale, not just what it looks like, but actually with the measurements, what's down there, which is really difficult to do when you can't see very far, and there's a lot of swell action, or we call it surge. So you're underwater, and the waves goes over top, and it makes you move just enough that it would mess up your drawing and your measurements. And there is citizen science with this as well. You could be trained, if this is something that really interests you, you could be trained. It's a course called NAS, the National Archaeological Society, I believe is what it's called. And they run them in North Carolina, where you could go to a series of classes and be trained to work on a project like this in the basic forms. If you didn't want to go back to grad school, you could do that so that you could go out there and support these projects. And so this is their work. All those pieces of paper, they're called mylar. It's like a plastic paper so it doesn't rip when it gets wet. They take all of that, and then they have to put it all together on one piece of paper, and then they finally go to ink after it's been drawn in pencil by everyone. But you could probably imagine if we were on a dive team and our job was to look at a specific part of the shipwreck, and the next dive team was supposed to look at the next part of the shipwreck, and we don't talk about it till the end of the week when we're putting it all together, there's sometimes pieces that are missing. There's sometimes pieces that don't make sense, or we have a beam going like this, and then the next person drew it going that way, and we have to figure out what's going on. So there's a lot of discussion that takes place when they're trying to put the whole thing together. It takes hours and hours for them to trace it all out and get it exactly like it looks underwater. Sometimes they have to go back underwater too. Sometimes you can't just talk about it. Sometimes they're missing a piece and they have to go back and redraw it all. All right, so I'll take some questions. I did want to mention too that if you guys are really interested in scuba diving, but maybe it's not for you, but you have grandkids or kids that are really interested in all these types of things, we run summer camps all summer. We're doing 17 summer camps this year at CSI. We do a scuba camp where we train students how to be scuba divers, and when they leave, they have their certification. We do a shipwreck camp that focuses on all these things: estuaries, marine biology, oceanography. All those camps are happening this summer right down the street at CSI.